All right, I got the go ahead. I want to go ahead and kick us off today, mainly to keep us on schedule. As you guys heard, we have a lot of sessions today, so I would hate to be the one that breaks the schedule there. So welcome, everyone, and good morning. On behalf of the Resisting Authoritarian Pressure cohort, co-led by the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Freedom House, and the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, and now in partnership with OECD, I'm delighted to moderate today's session on the Resistance Playbook, Countering Foreign Interference and Transnational Repression. My name is Danielle Pianskevich. Greetings. So since the launch of our cohort in 2022, we have remained committed to advancing the aim to build resilience to authoritarian coercion and offer support to Democrats and human rights defenders working from non-democracies. As outlined in our key objectives, which are bringing visibility to the stories of political prisoners, increasing pressure of their release, sheltering and protecting democratic activists fleeing authoritarian regimes, countering the phenomenon of transnational repression, and building resilience to economic coercion by authoritarian regimes. So we have continued to advance these goals over the couple years and by our respective organizations and by collective means. I won't go into too much detail about each country because we're actually going to kickstart today's discussion, which will be focusing on addressing foreign interference and transnational repression, promoting global cooperation, and formulating a unified policy to respond to countering authoritarian regimes. So fundamentally, we want to take a page out of the authoritarian playbook and adopt a defensive strategy and develop our own playbook of resistance. So to kickstart us, we're going to be actually starting with a video message from Michael Abramowitz, who's the president of Freedom House. He unfortunately couldn't join us today. We are actually joined today by my colleague and my cohort partner, Katie LaRoque. But we're going to hear a quick message from him addressing the situation and talking a little bit more about what Freedom House is working on. Thank you.
Good morning from Washington, D.C. I'm Mike Abramowitz, the president of Freedom House. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's important conversation on the Resistance Playbook, Countering Foreign Interference and Transnational Repression. While I wish I were able to join you all in person today, Freedom House is honored to co-host this event with our longtime partners in the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Alliance of Democracies. Together, we launched the Resisting Authoritarian Pressure cohort back in 2022 as part of the Summit of Democracy framework. Our cohort's mission is to build resilience against authoritarian interference and to offer support to frontline human rights defenders in unfree societies, as well as those working in exile. Specifically, we seek to spur action in 4 key areas: elevate the stories of political prisoners and advocate for their release, help governments design policies to protect democratic activists fleeing authoritarian regimes, stand up to economic pressure from authoritarian regimes, and counter transnational repression. Which brings me to the subject of today's discussion. Transnational repression is a deeply disturbing trend of authoritarians reaching across their borders to intimidate, harass, even murder their critics. They want to send a message that nowhere is it safe for activists, journalists, whistleblowers, or persecuted minorities. Since 2014, Freedom House has documented more than 1,000 cases of direct physical transnational repression at the hands of 44 governments that have reached into 100 target countries. Our data set is based on publicly available information, which means the actual number is probably much higher. It also does not include digital incidents of transnational repression, such as online harassment or spyware attacks. The most egregious perpetrators of transnational repression are the governments of China, Turkey, Tajikistan, Russia, and Egypt. The Chinese Communist Party alone accounts for 25% of all documented incidents. One particularly striking statistic: more than 1 in 5 national governments engaged in transnational repression. In 2023, Freedom House documented new publicly known cases of transnational repression by the governments of Cuba, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, El Salvador, Myanmar, Sierra Leone, and Yemen. Which brings me to today's event. We, as a global community of democratic governments and civil society, must protect the brave activists and human rights defenders who put their lives on the line every day, especially when they seek safe haven within our borders. It is not just a matter of values, but of national security. Ahead of last year's second Summit for Democracy, Freedom House prepared a declaration of principles to combat national repression, which acknowledges the threat of transnational repression and indicates a commitment to take preliminary action to address it. I am proud to share that 9 governments, including the United States, Lithuania, Australia, Germany, Chile, Estonia, Kosovo, Latvia, and Slovakia, endorsed the declaration. To those in government, we welcome additional endorsements for the declaration. I also encourage everyone to visit our website, freedomhouse.org, for detailed policy recommendations to consider. To those of you in civil society, Freedom House invites you to consider joining our coordination group to counter transnational repression, which has met regularly since the second Summit for Democracy to identify policy solutions to combat transnational repression and help our community conduct joint advocacy. We invite groups that are interested to reach out to us and learn more. And so with that, let me express my sincere gratitude to all of you for being here today to discuss this vital issue, one we can and must face together. Thanks also to our impressive panel, all of whom are working hard to raise awareness of authoritarian interference. Together, we can make a difference. I wish you an excellent discussion and a fruitful summit. Thank you.
Great. I think that opens up the conversation well. And on that note, I'm actually going to welcome our panel to the stage. While they come up to the stage, I just wanted to mention, so Freedom House outlined really well what they're working on for the last couple of years around our cohort. Just to note that Lithuania has been aiming to become a global democracy hub, hosting the Future of Democracy event to tackle authoritarian challenges. They've had 3 editions and plan to have additional ones. At the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, we've been pushing for unity against authoritarian economic coercion. We have coined it as the NATO economic, based on NATO's Article 5, called the Economic Article 5, which observes significant pushback from democracies against such pressures, and looking at EU Anti-Coercion Act as an example of this. So, as I mentioned, we'll be going into conversation today with our esteemed representatives from our members of our cohort, but of course other representatives that really harness the energy and the issues that we wanted to discuss. So I'm going to go ahead and do a very brief introduction. So all the way to my right, and actually you guys have the photos right above, so you guys can keep track. We have Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, Egidijus Meilūnas. Since 1992, he's joined the Lithuanian Diplomatic Service, where he worked as diplomatic advisor to the president. General Inspector of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, and represented Lithuania as ambassador in Poland, Japan, Ireland, and a non-resident ambassador in Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Currently, he's a deputy minister of the Lithuanian MFA, where he supervises issues of formation and implementation of Lithuanian policy at the United Nations and the Council of Europe and other multilateral forums, as well as issues of economic diplomacy, export and investment promotion, and economic security. Sir, you have been around a lot of different regions and, of course, places that we're going to be diving into later today. So welcome. Next, we have Mr. Tsimafei Malakhouski, Belarusian activist in exile and program manager and political activist at Honest People, a civil society organization focusing on democratic civil engagement and countering disinformation in Belarus. Tsimafei's work primarily revolves around leveraging technologies to build civil society despite the pressure from Belarusian authoritarian regimes. He's currently a master's degree at the Oxford Internet Institute. Welcome. And then to the next, is my order was different here. So Miss Gillian Dorner, who is the Deputy Director for Public Governance at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. Since 2022, you've been in this role. Previously, she worked as a senior counselor at the OECD Public Governance Directorate, and then from 2020 2020 to 2022 as advisor for OECD Secretary General during 2011 to 2015. She has extensive knowledge of the work of the Public Governance Directorate as well as strong strategic vision of its priorities, having led work to structure and enhance the Directorate's impact over recent years, including through decision and delivery of the Public Governance Committee's Building Trust and Reinforcing Democracy initiative. Prior to joining OECD, Gillian served as a UK senior civil servant as Deputy Director of Financial Services Regulatory at Her Majesty's Treasury. Welcome. Last but not least, we have Ms. Hanna Song, who's the Executive Director at the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, otherwise known as NKDB. Since joining in January 2024, she's held this role. She's been there actually since 2015 and manages the organization's international cooperation activities, where her responsibility is to convey the NKBD's work to the international community and brief diplomats, policymakers, and foreign correspondents on the human rights situation in North Korea. And today you'll be talking to our group. She's also done research for NKBD, where she documents human rights violations that are inflicted upon North Koreans, part of your Unified Human Rights Database, the largest repository on human rights records, published reports on the human rights situation in North Korea's military humanitarian assistance to the North Korea and the Universal Periodic Review. So impressive panel. We're very excited to have you join us. I've actually asked our speakers to start with a kickoff question, follow up some additional guiding questions, and then we're going to open up to the audience to go ahead and engage with everyone here. I'm going to start with the Vice Minister. I have a few questions for him, just because they all really group nicely together to talk a bit about our dear partners in Lithuania. So in the EU, Lithuania has become an example of resistance when it comes to navigating economic pressures imposed by China. How does Lithuania balance the need to stand firm against coercion with the priority to maintain diplomatic relations and engage in dialogue with potentially coercive actors? Can you give us a little overview of how Lithuania has navigated this space, the lessons learned in other countries who are currently facing this similar situation, even goes beyond China? Now we're looking at Russia, coercion, and what is the importance of cooperation, information sharing among EU, and how can we best try to tackle this? Thank you, Vice Minister. Should be on already.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It's a great honor to be this morning with you. But first of all, I would like to thank our co-hosts of this event, namely Freedom House and Alliance of Democracy. Thank you very much for cooperation. Answering your very interesting and very timely question, I would start from, you mentioned Lithuania's experience dealing with China's coercive measures, but I would like to start by saying that Lithuania has more than 3 decades long experience dealing with authoritarian regimes and their coercive measures. In 1990, when we regained independence, 34 years ago, it was 11th of March when our parliament declared independence. In a few weeks, Moscow introduced total 100% economic blockade of Lithuania. At that time, we were 100% dependent on Russia. So that was our first experience, and we survived. Then speaking about Russia and neighboring Belarus, which in the beginning we had hope that they will choose a path of democratic development. Unfortunately, with Lukashenko taking power, Lukashenko made Belarus an authoritarian state. So we had many attempts from Russia and Belarus and other authoritarian regimes to make pressure on us. I can give you many examples, but just one very illustrative. Year 2014. At that time, we were 100% dependent on natural gas supplies from from Moscow. And we paid the highest price in Europe for natural gas, $543 for 1,000 cubic meters. But there were two reasons why we paid the highest price. One, as I mentioned, we were 100% dependent on supplies from Russia, but other, probably more important political reason, we were quite, not quite, but we criticized, we were negative with regard to Russia's aggressive behavior against other countries, Georgia, Ukraine. As you know, Russians attacked for the first time Ukraine 10 years ago. So that was why they made us to pay the highest price. But starting from 2015, when we opened our national LNG terminal, we started to pay normal price. We started to buy gas from United States and Norway. So that is, I believe, very important example how, especially for small and medium-sized countries, it's important not to be dependent on autocratic regimes. And now you mentioned China. Yes, in 2021 we left this vicious format initiated by China, 17+1. Then we started more active cooperation with Taiwan. So in December 2021, they introduced 100% blockade of our export. Again, it was to some extent dramatic experience, but again, we survived. And last example, 3 days ago, Lukashenko introduced 100% of blockade of Lithuania's export to Belarus because we closed 2 more border crossing points. That was a reaction from their side. Now I would like to present you some figures from our foreign trade statistics illustrating that all those measures introduced by recently autocratic regimes against Lithuania, they almost have no effect. Lithuania's foreign trade in 2023. Lithuanian origin export, 87% of Lithuanian origin export in 2023 went to like-minded countries, EU, NATO, Indo-Pacific, European Economic Area. Only less than 1%, 0.9, went to autocratic Belarus, Russia, and China. We decoupled. In fact, we decoupled from China, from Russia, from Belarus. They have no leverage on us using economic coercion instruments. I would be happy to share with you many more examples, but what is important, lessons learned, and what we would like to advise to other countries. So, 5 points. First of all, never trust autocratic regimes. Never. They share not the same values as us, and their goal, be it Russia, China, or autocratic Belarus, or Iran, North Korea, their main goal is to destroy our rules and values-based world order. Second, I would like to quote NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Last year, 2023, he made 2 important statements. One is, I quote, "Freedom is more important than free trade," and second one, "Preserving our values is more crucial than pursuing profit." That means considering your potential economic cooperation with autocratic regimes, you have to think seriously, national security versus profit. Our choice is very clear. National security is top priority. Our national intelligence community every year in March they make a public report on threats to Lithuania's national security, and starting from 2019, they name 3 countries: Russia, Belarus, and China as 3 countries posing main threat to Lithuania's national security. Number 3, third point, resilience. Dealing with autocratic regimes, you have to be resilient. You can increase your resilience by many ways. Diversification of your trade, effective FDI, foreign direct investment screening system, strategic infrastructure protections. But the most important point is unity. Together we are stronger. So being members of European Union and NATO, close partners to Indo-Pacific countries, we small Lithuania, 2.8 million population, we feel very strong. And I would like to give you some figures demonstrating that we really are stronger than autocrats. Russia's GDP last year was 1.8 trillion US dollars. It's less than Italy and more or less the same as South Korea, Republic of Korea. China's GDP was around 18 trillion. So altogether, around 20. Now, EU plus NATO countries' GDP last year was 52 trillion. That means 2.7 times more than Russia plus China. If we add 4 AP4 countries, Republic of Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, we have 60 trillion GDP. AP4, EU, NATO, so that means more than 3 times. So together, it's obviously we are stronger. And last but not least, just I would like to give you an example of how important legal regulation is in the framework of EU. So during last 3 years, European Union approved EU regulation on foreign direct investment screening, EU international procurement instrument, foreign subsidies regulation, EU Critical Materials Act, CHIPS Act. We started discussions on European Economic Security Strategy. We approved last year EU anti-coercion instrument. So these also are absolutely important elements, legal acts. They play a very important role also of, protecting union as such, individual national countries, including Lithuania. And these acts also play a crucial role of deterrence against coercive measures from autocratic regimes. So maybe I would stop here and would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Vice Minister. I think you also illustrated what happens beyond what Lithuania can do. And imagine if all democracies came together. And that's very much in line with what the Economic Article 5 that we're trying to do. And you really illustrate that. We see Australia also facing similar challenges. And we need to make the business model of why this would work. So thank you for outlining that and the great work your government has been doing. That should be a lesson for many others. So maybe taking a step back and then looking at the receiving side of this. So Tsimafei, you've been of course, a Belarusian in exile, and of course, because of your work that you've been doing and your beliefs. So I want to hear a little bit on your side of what are some of the common methods and strategies used by the Belarusian regime, which the Vice Minister outlined in the very beginning, that they're actually facing on a governmental level. But how is this happening to you on a personal, and of course, on how activists who are working the space to suppress dissident and undermine activities, opposition groups abroad? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for organizing this event and inviting me. I fled Belarus in 2020, avoiding political persecution. After the founder of my organization was arrested, I just packed my backpack and immediately, within 4 hours, left to Ukraine, to Kyiv, because also that was the country where Belarusians didn't need visa to. Right now, obviously this direction is closed. Before talking about the transnational repressions and practices Belarusian authoritarian regime actively uses, I would like to stress and focus on the situation inside the country. So actually the situation that people who flee the country try to avoid. In 2020, after the hundreds of thousands of Belarusians marched across the streets in Minsk and other cities, Belarusian regime reacted and targeted protesters by detaining those who were on the streets, and also targeting and arresting prominent political figures, oppositional leaders, and so on. It was the first wave of immigration. Those like me who felt that they are targeted, felt that they are endangered, they fled the country. It was estimated that around 100,000 people left Belarus within 2000, like half a year after events in August 2020. In 2021, Belarusian regime extended repressions and started to target journalists, started to target any sort of civil society activists, members of communities, student organizations, and so on. They also learned to use technologies, eventually, but obviously not for the good of the people. They started to use artificial intelligence, facial recognition to analyze the photos from the protests, and like published by international media. They started to use the technologies to de-anonymize people on Telegram, and so on and so forth. So that was the second wave of immigration, when those who anyhow were involved in the activities and the protest activities, they fled the country. In 2022 and 2023, after the start of the Russian invasion, full-scale Russian invasion to Ukraine, regime started to target those who anyhow expressed solidarity with Ukraine and stood up against the war. They started to arrest those who participated in anti-war demonstrations in Belarus, those who were commenting and posting on the issue and like expressing their anti-war position. Also, those who left the comments, those who wore the yellow and blue stripes in their hair, also those who sang the songs in Ukraine, and so on. So that was the third wave of immigration from Belarus. And lately, the most recent examples, Belarusian regime started to target people who anyhow express solidarity with those who, like the people who not necessarily were involved in the political or like civic activities, but those who anyhow express solidarity, for instance, by donating to the solidarity foundations, donating to Ukraine army, and also those who are relatives of activists, relatives of people in exile, relatives of fighters in the Ukraine army, Belarusian fighters in Ukraine army. Last week, my mother was interrogated as well because of the criminal case against me in Belarus. Yeah, they were asking for 3 hours. They were asking questions about any sort of connection with me and financial relations and so on and so forth. Me and the more than 300,000 people who exiled, they are lucky one. They managed to exile, to flee the country on time. However, there are 1,400 people who are right now recognized as political prisoners. They're held in custody in extremely conditions, without the access to healthcare. People often are held in this incommunicado conditions. There are no news, no letters from prominent political figures like Maria Kolesnikova, like Sergei Tikhanovsky, like Nikolai Statkevich, Igor Losik. And people who left the country and who tried to avoid those repressions, they are also targeted, as I mentioned. That's where the phenomenon of transnational repressions come in place. Belarusian regime built some sort of capacity to suppress the voices outside the country as well. The most prominent case, probably most of you heard of the landed plane, Ryanair flight from Athens to Vilnius. With Roman Protasevich and Sofia Sapega on board, the Belarusian journalists and civil society activists. But the other playbook of transnational repressions include also the misuse of Interpol mechanism, misuse of bilateral security agreement with countries like Armenia, with countries like Serbia, Belarusian regime also tried to suppress the voices outside the country by targeting the relatives, as I mentioned already, the unlawful searches, also interrogations, and sometimes arrest of relatives inside the country. This Belarusian regime also persecute and organize the unlawful trials against the activists abroad. They reappropriate and seize the property of the activists in exile, freezing the assets of exiled politicians and activists, but in Belarus. They also criminalized any sort of linkage between diaspora, between the opposition abroad and the people in the country. In Belarus right now, 400 organizations and independent media labeled as extremist in Belarus. It means that any sort of cooperation and even communication between people in Belarus and those organizations abroad is unlawful, and people are getting arrested because of this. Linkage, and by linkage, you should understand the following the web page of my organization in Belarus, or putting the likes or comments on the social media, or people are actually getting detained and stopped on the street, and their phones are being checked in order to find any sort of they check the following list and so on and so forth. Belarusian regime also hacking the activist account. They're duplicating the SIM cards, trying to pass the two-factor authorization authentications of the social media account of the any platform.
Tsimafei, if I can jump in, can
Yes,
I
please.
ask, what are some of the active steps that the international community could maybe do? Because what you're outlining are things that are not just in particular to Belarusian. So, I mean, is there something that you've been actively working on with honest people, or is there something that you would recommend to the international community?
Yeah, but I would say that that's a narrative that the Belarusian opposition and exile repeat, that like Belarusians are fight for democratic principles, and the democratic countries claim that they adhere to democratic principles, and we believe that we are needed to be supported in this fight, and the pressure on the authoritarian regime should be raised. And I'm talking here about the economic sanctions, and yeah, there have been many packages of sanctions from European Union and from the United States. However, there are still like loops in the sanctions, and the regime learned to go around and go around those sanctions. So that's also we believe that the raising economic pressure would force Belarusian regime to start negotiate and actually release political prisoners in Belarus in the end of the day. We also think that the Belarusian people abroad should be supported more than they are. As I mentioned, there's many Belarusians found their homes in Lithuania, in Poland, and in other countries in the democratic world. However, they still sometimes they face the problems with legalization in those countries. And I also didn't mention Belarusian regime last year enacted the law forbidding the renewal of passports abroad. It means that when the passports of Belarusian activists expire, the only way to renew the passport is to come back to Belarus and obviously being arrested. And some people who cannot find the legalization and support from the host countries in democratic world, they have nothing but to go to Belarus, risk, and we know about the at least 60 people who got arrested by returning back to Belarus. So therefore, the countries in democratic world should ease the procedure and should issue the travel documents and support the initiative of Belarusian opposition with the new Belarus passports, I believe. Yeah, and finally, the final note is to support the the Belarusian organizations abroad, obviously. That's those who have resources to support financially support the opposition in exile need to do this, because that's the only way to be connected with Belarusian people. Yeah, we use paid promotion, we create the content to fight the propaganda, the very strong propaganda from Russia and from Belarus, and yeah, that's the only way to build to keep Belarusians informed, to keep Belarusians who are against the war and who support support democratic values, to keep them informed and keep them supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsimafei. Thank you. And once again, what you described in your situation is unfortunately not alone. There's other countries that are, of course, dealing with it. We're going to hear a little bit more about, of course, North Korea in a moment. Gillian, I actually want to turn back to you, because we're talking about international cooperation, but OECD sits at both international and economic cooperation, which is, of course, what we've been building upon. What are some of the mechanisms we can do to actively counteract some of these foreign interference effects, both on governments, but also on individuals? Could you maybe give us a little bit of background on the work you guys are doing, and, of course, best practices and policy recommendations that you would give to the community here at the Summit for Democracy?
Thank you. Is that working okay? Great. So good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, as well as Freedom House. I have to say it's very humbling to hear some of these lived experiences of transnational repression. And I'm speaking to you, I would say, probably more from the international bureaucrat's perspective, but I actually think it's quite telling that the OECD is in this space. We are an economic and development organization by background. I work in the Public Governance Directorate, and what we are finding is that it's becoming more and more difficult to govern in the context of foreign interference. And so many of our member countries, some of them with very clear lived experience of foreign interference, like Lithuania, which is one of our member countries, but also countries that are not so used to that kind of foreign interference. You know, foreign interference has been around since the birth of the nation state, but not to the same degree that we're seeing today. And the prevalence of it, I think, is, we don't know for sure, but very clearly globalization, digitalization. We are seeing more and more opportunities for foreign interference in our democracies. And it is having a very negative impact in terms of democracy's ability to have open, consensus-based dialogue, but it's also impacting on the well-being of individuals on a daily basis. So you asked me a bit about best practices, what are countries doing? And I think the Vice Minister from Lithuania has already outlined many of the opportunities that the EU has been taking in this space through EU legislation, and really shining a light on some of the activities that are taking place. So there are three areas where the OECD has pinpointed the need for action at the kind of global collective level. One is about coming together to recognize the nature of the threat to our democratic societies. Foreign interference is multifaceted and often coordinated, as we have just heard. Responding to these threats requires a coordinated approach from the democracy side, beyond traditional security measures, with relevant public governance tools grounded in transparency. This includes, for example, from FDI screening through to political finance, including better regulating lobbying, tackling disinformation, ensuring stricter guardrails to scientific cooperation. There are many tools that exist, but they need to be well coordinated through a comprehensive strategy. And it requires us to have a common situation picture of the threat and information exchange between public institutions. So the second area, which I really wanted to hone in on, is transparency. Really, what is important here is shining a light on this activity, and it's one of the most efficient tools against foreign interference. by shedding a light on foreign influence activities through mandatory requirements such as public registries or transparency schemes such as those that we see with FARA in the United States, Australia, or the United Kingdom, and currently being discussed in Canada and France, as well as in the EU more widely, we can provide the possibilities for prosecution for foreign malign interference for those that aren't registered, but also strengthen public awareness of the risks of interference, building societal resilience at the same time. And third, I just wanted to mention, and this is a topic that I'm sure will be discussed throughout the day in most sessions, is the question of information integrity. Foreign interference is more and more so taking place through our information ecosystems, something that we're finding incredibly difficult to manage. We've actually just very recently, in the last few weeks, released a report called Facts Not Fakes, tackling disinformation, strengthening information integrity. And this report actually sets out some really excellent practices that are being picked up, for instance, in Finland and in the Netherlands, on, for example, information literacy, to equip societies with the skills to be able to recognize foreign interference through the information ecosystem, but also, for example, in France, through their new agency Viginum, which exposes foreign information manipulation campaigns such as the recent attack from Russia to destabilize European countries in the run-up to the elections. So these are just a few examples of what can be done. I should say that from an OECD perspective, foreign influence is absolutely fine if it's done in an open and transparent manner, and actually can be incredibly useful for our societies, for policy making, for global collaboration. But it's when it's done in the dark to cause harm that it's really having a negative impact on our democracies, on our individuals' well-being.
Thank you so much. I mean, on the information integrity and, of course, influence, I think is incredibly important, because we're also hearing about what's happening both on the governmental level, but on the individual level of how, we also have upcoming elections. I mean, South Korea also even has their upcoming elections. I mean, it's going to be something where if we're not sharing this information on best practices and communicating with, of course, tech companies, then how are we going to navigate this? So thank you for highlighting some of those really important aspects in the work that you guys are doing, and we'll definitely come back to that. I want to actually turn now to Hanna, because one, we have to remember where are we currently sitting. We are in South Korea, and we have, unfortunately, a very concrete example of what happens when you have transnational repression very close by, very close in proximity, and has been happening for, of course, several decades. So I would love to hear from you just about what the current situation is in North Korea, and the work that you are actively doing at NKDB, and understanding how to provide society with data and solutions to the structural issues at the core of the human rights situation, because once again, these can be applicable to multiple situations. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about your situation and the work you're doing. So, Hanna, thank you.
Great, thanks, Danielle. And just echoing the words of my fellow panelists of thanking all the organizers for putting on this great event, a very timely issue as well. As you mentioned, NKDB is a documentation organization. That is the core of what we do. It's at the crux of what we do. In an ideal situation, if you're going to gather information and evidence on human rights abuses, you go to the scene of the crime. You go to the scene of where the human rights abuses are occurring. In our case, we are documenting North Korean human rights abuses. We cannot go to North Korea to document these human rights violations. And we're not the only ones. Even the United Nations has a field office that should be based in Pyongyang, but is based in Seoul, South Korea, to be able to carry out its documentation efforts. So the way that we and many others carry out information collection is through interviewing the North Koreans who have left the country and have resettled in South Korea. There are about 34,000 North Korean escapees living in South Korea. You'll hear the word escapee, defector, refugee being used interchangeably on the issue. Our organization refers to them as escapees. At the peak of when we started finding out what the situation in North Korea was in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there were about 1,000, 2,000, close to 3,000 people coming every year into South Korea seeking freedom. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, in 2021, there were 63 people, only 63 people were able to come to South Korea. In 2022, 67. And in 2023, the numbers went up a little bit, 196, but only a handful, less than 10, were actually from the DPRK. The rest had been living in China and in Russia in secrecy, hiding from authorities. So for the North Korean government, the pandemic was perhaps the best thing that could ever have happened to them. And while I think we've all forgotten what it's like to live with the masks and do all the hybrid work, North Korea still remains very much closed. It was the most isolated country in the world, and it has become even more isolated as years has gone on. And that has made it very difficult for us to have an accurate picture of what exactly is going on inside North Korea. And for our community, it's very important for North Korean escapees who are living in freedom to be able to speak out confidently and proudly about what they are doing now, but also speak from a victim's perspective of what they went through and a survivor's perspective as well. But you'll see very, very few North Korean escapees being able to speak directly about their experiences. You know, ideally, I should not be on this panel. It should be a North Korean person speaking on this panel, speaking about the experiences, but they're afraid to do so because even living in South Korea, they still face threats from the DPRK. They receive threats about what will happen to their family members if they speak out about the situation. And this in the past has happened through phone calls, but as has been mentioned, the digitalization of everything has meant that even through social media, they're getting a lot more threats through networks in China and in Russia about what could potentially happen. Another issue that we are very concerned about in this community regarding the issue of transnational repression is, of course, the North Koreans who are living in overseas, namely in China and in Russia as well. Something that was mentioned was the coordinated efforts of these authoritarian regimes. As I mentioned before, 196 North Koreans were able to come to safety last year. The majority of these were women who were living in China for over a decade. When North Koreans, risk their lives to cross the border into China, they go seeking safety. But instead, what they're faced with is the threat that if the Chinese authorities catch them, they will be sent back to North Korea, where they face torture and even the risk of being sent to a political prison camp. So these women who came into South Korea last year had been in hiding for more than 10 years, in fear that they would be sent back to North Korea. And over the COVID-19 pandemic, the North Korean government had closed its borders, so China was not able to send any North Koreans back. But what we saw last year, after months and months of advocacy, we spoke on the Hill, we spoke to congressional members, China still sent back 500 North Korean escapees, well knowing what would happen when they were sent back to the DPRK. In our database, we have over 84,000 cases of human rights violations. 10% of these are forced repatriation issues, are issues of North Koreans who sought freedom but were sent back to an authoritarian regime. And this would not have been possible without the support of the Chinese government allowing for North Koreans to go back. And so I think something that we would also like to see more from this community is perhaps understanding how transnational repression is different in different contexts as well. It's not always just a country targeting their exiled community, but also the target the country working with their host countries to crack down on the exiled communities, but also their own people as well. And this brings me on perhaps my last point of TNR that we're seeing amongst the North Koreans who have been dispatched to Russia. Given the fact that North Korea faces a lot of sanctions from the international community, hard cash currency is very, very important to them. And the best way for them to do this is by dispatching their workers to work in Russia, China, and in the Middle East. The UN Security Council resolution, which was passed in 2017, bans them from doing this and actually bans host countries from allowing overseas workers to make a profit for the DPRK. Yet it continues. And what we've been seeing with the growing relationship between Putin and Kim Jong-un in recent months is that Russia is allowing more and more North Korean workers to come to their country to create a profit, which will fuel the nuclear and missile development in the DPRK. So again, what can we do to tackle this coordinated effort that we're seeing? I think, as was mentioned very clearly by our panelists, is also we need a coordinated effort from our side as well.
Excellent. Once again, putting together this playbook, that's in my mind. Vice Minister, I'm going to turn to you before we actually open to Q&A, so please prepare some questions. We've just heard from our esteemed experts up here about the digital, the economic, the security threats that are taking place to repressed individuals or peoples who have had to flee from autocratic regimes. I mean, Lithuania is a great example of hosting and bringing in, of course, Belarusians and Ukrainians for decades. So we'd love to hear from you about, what are some of the active things that Lithuania has been doing, but also would recommend other countries to start taking a little bit from your playbook.
As I already mentioned, we have some recommendations for other countries based on our lessons learned. So with regard to economy, I already presented some ideas, but main idea would be not to be naive with regard to autocratic regimes, because let's take an example of Russia. It was maybe starting from 1991, 2 decades of, let's say in this way, maybe it would sound brutally, total naivety from the West with regard to Russia. We Lithuanians, Poles, and other representatives of Central and Eastern European region, we told, don't trust Russians. They are autocrats. And what we heard in return, oh, you are Russophobes. You're just dealing with post-occupational trauma. Now they saying, our partners in the West, you were right. So the same with other autocratic regimes, China. Last year we hosted NATO summit in Vilnius. So at NATO AP4 collaboration session, many Western leaders said, we have not to repeat the same mistake we did with Russia. Don't trust China. So this is first. Second, you in one of your questions, you mentioned word dialogue. Dialogue with autocratic regimes. So I would like to ask you in this way. For example, Russia, Belarus, Putin, Lukashenko, they are war criminals. They are murderers. So what kind of dialogue you can imagine with them? Only one dialogue. There is International Criminal Court in Hague. That is a good place for dialogue with Lukashenko, Putin, and other war criminals. And this is crucial to bring them to justice, autocratic regimes. This is crucial. You know why Russia is so brutal in Ukraine? It's unbelievable. One of the main reasons, because they have this feeling of total impunity. Let's take history of last 100 years. They committed, now they attacking Ukraine, killing civilians, abducting children. committing other war crimes, including crime of genocide, but they did terrible crimes against other nations, including Lithuanian nation. In last 100 years, they attacked Poland in 1939, Finland, occupied Free Baltic State, then invasion to Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan, Georgia in 21st century, Ukraine twice, and they never have been brought to justice, never have been punished. So that is crucial. And one more with regard to dialogue. If there is a need of some dialogue with autocratic regimes, we, democratic community, we have to draw our red lines, because usually we hear from them, from Russians, from Chinese, here is our red line. Don't dare to cross it. Don't dare to cooperate with Taiwan, because this is a red line of communistic China. No, we have to say, here are our red lines, and don't dare to cross, because you will face very serious consequences. That would be my advice.
Excellent. And something we've been trying to work on within our cohort is economic red lines should definitely be one of those, and trade red lines. I'm going to ask any of our speakers want to react to anything. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and open to audience Q&A, which I already immediately see. I'm going to go ahead and bring the microphone, so I'm going to take it to the audience. Go ahead. And if you can introduce yourself, thank you.
Hello, I'm Mariam Gersamia, founder of Media Voice from Georgia. And first of all, I want to express big thanks to Lithuania, to Latvia, Estonia, for big efforts you're doing for Georgia, for Ukraine, for Belarus. And when you exist, there is a hope, really hope that we are not alone. And again, thank you for everything. And I have a question for you. When threats connected with Russia, and you have mentioned the experience we have, and if we had a chance to scroll back for 10 or 15 years, in your opinion, what should have been done differently regarding Russia when it comes to the EU position or other our friends? Thank you.
Can I get another question before we move on to the panel?
Thank you so much. I am Bate Allen. I am the country director for technology in Cameroon. I'm very, very much interested in this program. I'm so grateful. I want to ask this question, though I am not really, our continent is not part of Europe, but then I think that there's a lot of interventions from here that is affecting our continent, and nothing is being said about it. And we have a lot of escapees from most of our countries, from authoritarian regimes. If you are doing the study of Africa, you'll see that majority of African states are authoritarian. Majority, especially my country. And little or nothing is being said about it. And it's as if we don't matter. So it really pawns on me to ask this question. We are beginning to see a lot of Russian intervention in Burkina Faso, Russian intervention in Central African Republic. Lately, the Wagner Group has been signed. They signed a treaty with Congo to suppress the K23. And most of these interventions are because, according to them, there is a failure for democracy and the bad guys are winning. China is, of course, intervening in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. So I want to ask you, contextually, as far as Africa is concerned, what measures do you think young people, because I think the leak now has to go to the young people. Most of the governments are old. My president, for instance, is running for the next election, and he's 90-something years old. He's not willing to give power. And that means that majority of the hope is in young people, and we are 65% of the population of Africa. 65% young people. So what guarantee or what particular directions can we take as young people to be able to drive our continent into the right perspective for democracy, seeing that democracy in itself is not really gaining grounds in sub-Saharan Africa?
Excellent question. So if we can go back in time 10 years, what would we do differently? And also, how would we make this more of a global approach? Because, of course, he's 100% correct. Russia and China are now going beyond borders. They're going beyond the continent, and they're going into other regions. How do we make sure that these regions are part of the solution? But also, what can we do to make sure that both preventative and proactive measures? Perhaps I'll go to Gillian if you want to start and kick us off, and then we'll go ahead and address all the questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Danielle. And so I'm going to avoid the question about going back in time and what we would have done differently with Russia, because I don't think I'm the best person to speak on that. But in terms of the global approach, I think that I was coming to this in my initial remarks, but I think this is absolutely necessary. And it chimes with what the minister from Lithuania was saying, which is we're better together on this, because as we've discussed, the approach from these autocracies is very well coordinated, and we need to be coordinated in return, and that means involving all democracies, not just looking at this from regional perspectives. And I think one of the points that the minister from Lithuania was making is that for a long time, some countries hadn't woken up to what's been happening. Well, I think there's a sign that people are waking up now, and now is the opportunity to really forge that global approach, and that requires us to really map out what the main threats are, how those threats are interlinked, how those responses are being, attacks are being coordinated, and therefore what in response is our strategy towards that. So I very much agree with the comment made around sub-Saharan Africa in this context.
Maybe I'll just quickly jump to Hanna, and then I'll actually have you both address questions. But Hanna, I mean, you've already raised the issue of China already going beyond, kind of their due diligence in the sense of sending back refugees to North Korea when it's not even maybe their refugees or members in exile. Can you give a little bit more examples of how you see that role, where maybe other governments can kind of help create a little bit more of that coordinated control against what China and, of course, maybe now what we see Russia doing in other regions beyond their borders?
Yeah, I think this was sprinkled around a little bit, but also just moving beyond the role of governments, but also corporations, and I think corporate responsibility. I think that's something perhaps our colleague from Africa is seeing as well, of Chinese companies representing the government, or Russian companies representing the Russian government, being able to play a bigger role, and that not looking like it's the government having that interference. So, how can we get more, like-minded corporations with these democratic values to be upholding these values in these regions, I think is something that we need to be looking at as well. Something that our organization looks at very closely is where North Korean overseas workers are being exploited within the supply chain of when you're receiving, your Nike trainers. Were North Koreans part of that in these factories in China? And I think that's something we keep needing to, we spoke about accountability as well. It's not just accountability for governments, but also those who are making a profit through the exploitation of TNR is something that I think we would like to see a little bit more as well.
I'll turn the last two questions, actually, if you want to respond both to the Vice Minister, and then Timothy, I'll have you join as well.
I would like to briefly respond to a colleague from Georgia. So answering your question on mistakes we made. So yes, we have to be frank. We made many mistakes. As I mentioned, we were too naive with regard to autocratic regime, specifically Russia. And one of mistakes was made in 2008 in Bucharest, saying that Georgia and Ukraine will be members of NATO, but we did nothing to really invite you. And then 2008, Putin attacked Georgia, 2014 attacked Ukraine. So that is a very clear example when you just made some declarations, but no practical words implementing it. But on also one comment, you mentioned threat from Russia. I believe not necessarily all partners, allies in the West understand that today Russia poses existential threat to Europe. What they say about Ukraine and Ukrainians. This country, this nation does not exist. They say clearly, Putin, Medvedev. They also say the same about Belarusians. It's the same nation like Russians. There is no distinction among Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians. Even more, they say, you Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, how dare you to go against Russia? You should be exterminated. They say publicly. Putin's activities are supported by more than 80% of Russians. They are indoctrinated with 21st century fascist ideology, which they call themselves Ruski Mir in Russian language, Russian world. What is core essence of this ideology? Supremacy of one nation, namely Russian nation, against others. Other nations have no right to exist. So this is not just like a, threat, traditional. This is an existential threat.
Yeah, I would, in the first place, would like to respond in regard to do not talk to dictators, but please do talk to people. And Belarus is, we openly say this, that Belarus is 2 times occupied. It's occupied by Belarusian authoritarian regime, Lukashenko's regime, and occupied by Russia, by Putin's regime. And we keep saying that we need the democratic governments need to separate the Belarusian regime from Belarusian people. It's not the same, and Belarusians pay very high price to resist the regime and adhere to democratic values. And we believe that the Iron Curtain should not be put in front of Belarus when we draw the line between Europe, democratic Europe, and Belarus. We should not do this, and the people-to-people contact visas are crucial because we need to protect Belarusians from this ideology from Russia, this Ruski Mir ideology. We need to show the perspective, the European perspective, the life in Europe and freedom world to Belarusian people. I also would like to back Hanna's point about bringing not only government, but businesses and big tech to the table as well. Sometimes they can do even more than the government can, especially when it comes to transnational repressions, but also when it comes to being in contact with the people in Belarus, for instance. Just an example, Meta and Facebook and Instagram, we very much rely on in terms of the communication to people in Belarus. We use social media and use social media promotion, but the current policy of Meta, also following the Digital Services and Digital Media Act, forbid what they call the foreign electoral interference. So it means that the Meta restricts any sort of advertisement from outside the country in Belarus. So we, the Belarusian opposition, Belarusian media, we cannot rely on organic reach in Belarus because our organization labeled as extremist, so people cannot follow us, cannot comment, cannot put likes. But we cannot also use the tools of paid promotion because the big tech just abstain from any sort of involvement in the political issues on their platforms. Also, when it comes to the repressions and the hacking the accounts and they're looking for evidence, like when the regime is looking for evidence, trying to search the social media of the activists they arrest. Sometimes the very fast, immediate actions can save years of prison for Belarusians, and that's the role of big tech in this regard. Thank you.
If it makes you feel better, even Alliance, we were blocked a few times trying to help election integrity in other countries because we're not based there, so we're with you in that boat. All right, we had another question here.
Thank you. So my name is Baharul. I'm from the Asia Investigative Reporting Network. And just to continue about the elections, very interesting because in 2024, I guess this is super year where when about like 50, I don't know, 70 countries are having or welcoming the election days. So my question, particularly maybe for Gillian, is if you turn out into the election result, and my question would be, from that 50 to 70 countries who are now like having or welcoming elections, where it will be going? I mean, in terms of whether the result of the election is strengthening democracy, or these 50 to 70 countries are actually turn their back, to democracy. That's going to be my first questions. And and the second one is whether or not in that trend we can really identify any transnational repressions to make the result is is going to, whether it's going to be like strengthening democracy or turn around to democracy. So that's my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Since those were two questions, we'll go ahead and turn to the panel to quickly address. So Gillian, if you want to address this first point.
Thank you. So I think your question around the elections was kind of what impact is this going to have in this mega year of elections in 2024? I mean, I think the honest answer is we don't know now for sure, and we'll only find out afterwards. There are significant efforts being made to protect the electoral processes. In many countries, in particular in the EU, there are significant efforts being made. But I think what we also have to remember is that quite a bit of the foreign interference that we're seeing isn't necessarily directly targeted at elections. So it can be directly targeted at swaying the results of election or on political finance. But actually quite a bit of it is much more subtle than that. It's about sowing distrust amongst our societies, confusion around what the facts are of the democratic debate that is taking place in the run-up to the elections. So it's incredibly difficult to know exactly what impact that is having on electoral results. I'm afraid to say that we'll have to wait and see. But I think what's important is that we do as much as possible to gather the data, the evidence, to see what is happening there, and to learn from that as we move forward.
Maybe Timothy, to you on the second part of the question, which I thought was quite interesting, of how elections can affect those who are in transnational repression. I mean, how do you vote for a region that you might not be able to vote in? And just wanted to know how you've been able to navigate there, or how are you working on that maybe within your work?
Belarusian regime also, like recently in end of February, hold the elections, parliamentary elections in Belarus. It's a fake institution, and the elections were also fake, that they were not recognized by democratic world. But interestingly, the Belarusian regime 2 years ago, recognizing this threat from diaspora, from people abroad, forbid the did not open the polling stations abroad, and like they deprived even potentially the right to vote in Belarusian elections. We, however, see any sort of elections or electoral procedure as an opportunity to talk to the people as well. Yeah, and as I said, we rely on the paid promotion and technologies in order to talk to the people and explain the young generation that already there is the generation that's been raised without any sort of alternative, without the access to independent news and information. And it's crucial right now, it's crucial to talk to them, to show them the alternative does exist, and the democratic world stands behind and support them in the democratic path.
And then before I turn to Vice Minister, but we definitely need to make sure that the democratic community is also upholding electoral values and democratic values too. So Vice Minister, to you.
If I may very briefly, again, stronger together, we are stronger. So with regard to disinformation, cyber attacks, hybrid attacks, autocratic regimes work together very closely. We last 2-3 years analyzing, activities, malign activities of Russia and China. We noticed that they are cooperating between themselves and sharing their narratives. Russians sharing Chinese narratives, including against Lithuania, and vice versa. Chinese blaming NATO for war against Ukraine and so on. So yesterday at the plenary session, actually, I suggested on behalf of Lithuania that we should cooperate much closer and even maybe to think about establishing a coalition of like-minded countries in this regard. And actually, when we speak about cooperation between transatlantic and Indo-Pacific communities, our security is strongly interlinked. So cybersecurity, hybrid disinformation, those fields could be, very promising for our future cooperation.
But I would definitely add our colleagues also in the global South as well, Latin America and Africa, of course, definitely need to be part of these conversations, but 100% coordinated effort. Do we have any more questions? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and go to kind of our closing wrap up. We only have a few minutes left. Maybe Hanna, I'll start with you because you've actually raised the issue and the topic around how businesses and, it can also be play a part in this. One of the things that we've been advocating within our cohort is that, as I keep mentioning, the Economic Article 5, but it goes beyond that. It's an alliance of democracies that use their economic kind of power to offset some of the pressures. Is this something that you think the Summit for Democracy, whatever form it goes into the future, do you see this being an avenue, the economic side of this, to help both promote kind of the work you've been doing on North Korea, but of course on transnational repression as well? And then this will be kind of closing remarks. Anything, other reflections?
Yes, thanks, Danielle. I think one of the major themes that have been raised during this Summit for Democracy is also the role of AI and tech as well, also being used for good, not just as a form of TNR and oppression as well. And I think that's something that we as the human rights community can definitely get on board with. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, North Korea is the most isolated country in the world. During the COVID-19 pandemic, North Korea enacted several more laws that would criminalize North Koreans coming into contact with any form of South Korean media. And we've seen, K-pop, K-dramas take over the world by a storm, and is also having that impact in North Koreans, among the youth as well. But in North Korea, if you're caught watching a South Korean movie, if you're caught saying a South Korean word with a South Korean dialect, that can lead to a political prison sentence. And that's something that we would like to be able to address working with tech, of how can we safely share information to North Koreans who have no access to the internet, who have no access to television news that isn't being created by their own government. And that's definitely something that needs to go beyond just governments funding small projects, but the skill sets that tech can bring. And just to wrap up as well with, something that Gillian mentioned was that foreign interference isn't always a bad thing if it's being done, transparently, and if it's being done well. And on the topic of, elections coming up as well, of the 50 to 70 countries that are facing elections, yes, many of them will just reinstate the autocratic leadership they have, but also many of them are democratic countries as well. And what can we be voting for so that these countries can be upholding these democratic values in other countries as well? The US government, the Japanese government, the South Korean government all have the North Korean Human Rights Act, which support organizations to document human rights violations and also to seek accountability to end impunity. That's done through democratic governments, and that has been done through elections as well. So how can we use our vote to stop the growing TNR that we're seeing across the global community is something that perhaps I'd like to leave us all with as well.
Thank you. Gillian, any closing reflections?
Just very briefly, I mean, I think I've come from a different perspective here, more from the kind of foreign interference perspective, but I think what's very interesting is that there's a real sense that democracies are coming together to recognize that we need to take more concerted action in this space, and that we need to bring together all parts of the world, all democracies, not just one part. I very much hope that these discussions can continue as part of the Summit for Democracy process, however that continues, and that the OECD is here to support that, in particular through two areas that we're working on the moment, which is mis and disinformation, but also moving from looking solely at lobbying to looking at broader undue influence in our economies.
Timothy, to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I would refer back to the point made a couple of times yesterday. This point was made about the Arab Spring and technologies, and how the technologies was optimistically seen as the democratizing tool. And it was the same for us in 2020. That was clear that because of technologies and social media and the civil society, that they managed to employ those, the biggest wave of the biggest attempt to democratize my country was made. However, right now it's clear that the autocrats learn to master technologies even better than us democratic activists, because they invest a lot of money in using artificial intelligence, making sense of big data, and also producing the high quality propaganda. Therefore, definitely more resources is needed to resist this. Like we need to support those who fight, who resist this threat, who resist this development of the autocratic technological tools. We need to invest in the pro-democracy technological tools and the pro-democracy resilience. Therefore, those who fight need to be supported, I believe.
Vice Minister, to you. Closing remarks.
I would like to end with the same quotation from I mentioned in the beginning, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO. I quote, "Preserving our values is more crucial than pursuing profit." That is our message to our friends and allies. Of course, profit is important. GDP per capita, GDP growth is very important, but we can easily generate it dealing among ourselves. We don't, in fact, need autocratic regimes for generating our GDP, and paradoxically, they are more dependent on us. One of sources for their strengths is our economic cooperation with them. So let's start maybe as European Union leaders from de-risking. That would be first good step in the right direction, but in principle, let's decouple from them, and then it would be our economies and societies would be much healthier, and we would be more determined to make good decisions, to draw our red lines, and to more effectively help assist people who are right now suffering from autocratic regimes.
Thank you. So beyond foreign interference, we need to align more on digitalization, on security, and most importantly, I would say economically as well. The one big takeaway I have today is that we can't just wait for the next Summit for Democracy to discuss these issues. The one good note is that our cohort with the Freedom House Alliance of Democracies Foundation and Lithuania MFA, along with our new cohort buddies, we're going to just adopt you now, OECD, we're going to continue this work in our relative work on a daily basis, and we invite our friends here to continue the work we're doing, and I really appreciate everyone here joining us for this morning's session. So applause to our panel, and thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.